At the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the Gilded Spoon, money didn't just talk, it screamed. And no voice was louder or more feared than Eleanor Blackwood's. Wife of the billionaire industrialist Richard Blackwood, she was a woman carved from ice and venom, capable of ending a career with a single condescending glance. Every waiter trembled when her Bentley pulled up. Every chef held their breath. For years, she was the undisputed tyrannical queen of their world. They all believed she was untouchable. Then a new waitress named Sophie started her shift. She was quiet, unassuming, and had eyes that saw far more than anyone gave her credit for. And she was about to do the one thing no one had ever dared make the millionaire's wife look utterly and completely ridiculous. The air in the Gilded Spoon was different when Eleanor Blackwood was expected. It wasn't just the quiet hum of professionalism that manager Michael Davies insisted upon. It was something heavier, a palpable tension that settled over the plush velvet chairs and gleamed nervously from the polished silverware. The staff moved with a frantic, yet hushed precision, their faces tight with anxiety. To an outsider, it might have looked like the pinnacle of fine dining service. To the initiated, it was a drill for survival. Sophie Collins, on her third day, was still learning the choreography of fear. She watched from her station near the service bar as her colleagues, seasoned veterans of the city's culinary scene, scurried like mice before the shadow of a hawk. David, a waiter with 10 years of experience and prematurely greying hair, was meticulously repolishing already immaculate wine glasses. She once had a busboy fired because his tie was a millimetre off centre. He muttered to Sophie without looking at her, his voice low and strained. Didn't even speak to him, just pointed a manicured finger at Davies and said, "Handle that!" The kid was gone before the appetizers hit her table. Sophie just nodded, her expression neutral, as she folded linen napkins into perfect crisp swans. She had come to the Gilded Spoon, seeking anonymity and a steady paycheck, a quiet port in the storm of her own life. She had fled a small town with nothing but a worn suitcase and a history she was desperate to outrun. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention, but as she listened to the hushed, frantic tales of Eleanor Blackwood, she felt a flicker not of fear, but of a weary, grim familiarity. She had known bullies before, though they hadn't worn Chanel or dripped with diamonds. They all operated from the same playbook of power and intimidation. At precisely 8 o'clock, the Bentley, a silent black phantom, glided to the curb. The doorman, a former Marine named Frank, who flinched at nothing, seemed to shrink by an inch as he opened the passenger door. Eleanor Blackwood emerged. She wasn't a large woman, but her presence filled the space entirely. She was flawlessly assembled, a masterpiece of cold, expensive beauty. Her silver hair was swept into an immaculate chignon, her frame draped in a midnight blue dress that probably cost more than Sophie's car, and her eyes, a startling, pale grey, swept across the dining room like a searchlight looking for imperfections. Her husband, Richard Blackwood, a titan of industry whose face was a regular feature in financial journals, followed a step behind her. He was a tall, imposing man, but in his wife's orbit he became a mere accessory. His presence muted his expression, perpetually distant. They were shown to table 12, the best in the house, a secluded alcove with a panoramic view of the city skyline. It was David's table. Sophie watched as he approached, his back ramrod straight, a practiced smile plastered on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening, Mrs. Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice, a perfect modulation of deference. Eleanor didn't acknowledge him. Her gaze was fixed on the single rose in the small crystal vase at the center of the table. She reached out with 2 perfectly manicured fingers and nudged a petal. "This one is beginning to wilt, David," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the sharp crack of a whip. It wasn't a complaint, it was an accusation. It suggests a certain inattention to detail, a sloppiness that I find troubling. David's face paled. "My sincerest apologies, Mrs. Blackwood. I will have it replaced immediately." He practically sprinted away, returning moments later with a fresh vase, his hands trembling slightly. Sophie watched the entire exchange, her hands still. She observed the way Eleanor's lips curled into a barely perceptible smirk of satisfaction. It wasn't about the flower. It was never about the flower. It was about establishing dominance, about reminding everyone in the room of their place in her world. Richard Blackwood simply stared out the window, his expression unreadable, as if the entire scene were taking place in a different dimension. Later that evening, Sophie was tasked with delivering a bottle of water to table 12. It was a simple task, a test from Davies to see how she handled proximity to the dragon. As she approached, she kept her eyes downcast, moving with a quiet efficiency she'd perfected. "The S. Pellegrino, Mrs. Blackwood," she said softly, placing the bottle gently on the table. Eleanor's cold eyes flickered towards her, taking in her simple black uniform, her plain tied-back brown hair, her lack of makeup. It was a dismissive, evaluative glance that lasted no more than a second, but it felt like a full-body scan. Sophie was deemed insignificant, a piece of furniture, a non-entity. "See that you chill the glasses next time," Eleanor said not to Sophie, but to the air in front of her. "I despise room-temperature glass. It's uncivilized." "Of course," Madame Sophie replied, her voice even. She didn't scurry away. She simply gave a small, correct nod and retreated with a measured, calm pace. She felt Eleanor's eyes on her back, a flicker of surprise in their cold depths. People were supposed to scurry. They were supposed to flinch. This new, unremarkable waitress hadn't. Back in the relative safety of the kitchen, David let out a shaky breath. "You survived?" he said, half joking. "She hates everything. Last week she claimed the consommé had a melancholy aura." Sophie offered a small, tight smile. "She just sounds lonely." David stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "Lonely? She's a piranha in couture. She thrives on misery. Your compassion is dangerously misplaced here, Sophie." Sophie didn't argue. She just went back to her duties, her mind replaying the scene. She had seen the flicker in Eleanor's eyes when she hadn't reacted as expected, and in that flicker she saw not the invulnerable goddess of high society everyone else saw, but a woman whose entire identity was built on the fragile foundation of other people's fear. It was a foundation Sophie knew from bitter experience could be surprisingly easy to crack. She hadn't come here looking for a fight, but she also knew she would not, could not be one of the ones who scurried. The dragon of the Gilded Spoon had finally met someone who wasn't afraid of being burned. A week passed, and the staff at the Gilded Spoon began to breathe a little easier. The Blackwoods had not returned, and the restaurant settled back into its normal rhythm of high-pressure, high-stakes service. Sophie blended in seamlessly. She was efficient, observant, and unfailingly polite. She learned the regulars memorized their preferences and developed a reputation for being unflappable. Mr. Davies, the manager, was impressed. He saw a professionalism in her that belied her quiet demeanor. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Collins," he'd told her after a particularly demanding Saturday night service. "You don't rattle." Sophie had simply thanked him. She didn't explain that, after what she'd been through, a demanding diner asking for their steak, cooked 1 degree rarer, was hardly a crisis. Her past had been a crucible forging a calm that some mistook for coldness. It was, in reality, a shield. Then, on a Tuesday evening, the Bentley returned. The familiar chill descended upon the dining room. This time, however, there was a change. When the Blackwoods were seated at table 12, Eleanor's gaze swept the room and landed on Sophie. A small, cold smile touched her lips. When David approached to take their order, Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "No, not you tonight, David. I want her." She pointed a single, perfectly lacquered nail directly at Sophie. A collective silent gasp seemed to pass through the staff. It was a test, a game. David shot Sophie a look of pure panic. Mr. Davies, standing near the host stand, visibly tensed. To refuse was unthinkable. Sophie felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but her expression remained serene. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and walked towards the table. She moved with a purpose that felt like walking into a lion's den, armed with nothing but a notepad. "Good evening, Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and steady. "What can I get for you this evening?" Eleanor leaned back, her grey eyes glittering with malicious amusement. She was going to make this difficult. "We'll start with the oysters Rockefeller. Then for my husband, he'll have the Chateaubriand medium rare with the sauce béarnaise on the side. Make sure the chef understands, medium rare. Not medium. Last time it was a tragedy." She paused, then turned her full attention to her own order. "I am feeling particular tonight. I want the pan-seared scallops. However, I don't want the standard saffron risotto it comes with. I find saffron to be a dreadfully common spice. I want them served on a bed of simple lemon and herb orzo, and the scallops must be seared for precisely 90 seconds on each side. Not a second more, not a second less. Can your kitchen handle such a complex request?" It wasn't complex. It was needlessly complicated, designed to be messed up. It was a trap. Sophie didn't flinch. She simply wrote it down. "Of course, madam. 90 seconds per side, served on a lemon herb orzo. An excellent choice." And to drink, Eleanor seemed momentarily thrown off by the lack of flustered panic. "We will have a bottle of the 1998 Chateau Margaux, and I want it decanted for exactly 30 minutes before it is brought to the table. Time it, 30 minutes exactly." "Very good, Mrs. Blackwood." Sophie confirmed, her pen moving calmly across the paper. She looked at Richard Blackwood, who hadn't spoken a word. "And for you, Sir Will, the Margaux be to your liking." For the first time that evening, Richard Blackwood looked up from the window. His eyes met Sophie's, and for a fleeting moment she saw a flicker of something, not disinterest, but a deep, weary sadness. "That will be fine, thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. Sophie gave a slight nod and turned to leave. Waitress Eleanor's voice cut through the air. Sophie turned back. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. What is your name?" "It's Sophie, madam." "Well," Sophie Eleanor said, drawing the name out as if tasting something unpleasant. "Let's see if you are as competent as you seem to think you are." Sophie retreated to the kitchen, her heart finally hammering against her ribs. The head chef, a temperamental Frenchman named Jean-Pierre, scowled when he saw the order. 90 seconds orzo sacre bleu. "She does this to mock me," he fumed. "She does this to get me fired," Sophie corrected him calmly. "But we're not going to let that happen, are we? Chef, 90 seconds on the scallops. I'll make the orzo myself, if I have to." Jean-Pierre stared at her. Then a slow grin spread across his face. He admired guts. "No, I will sear them to perfection. You go time her precious wine." Sophie meticulously handled every detail. She set a timer on her phone for the wine. She communicated the order to the kitchen with absolute clarity. She ensured the glasses were chilled. When the 30 minutes were up, she presented the decanted wine. She poured a small amount for Richard to taste, as was customary. He swirled it, sniffed, and nodded his approval. Eleanor watched Sophie's every move, her eyes narrowed. The food arrived timed perfectly. Sophie placed the Chateaubriand before Richard and the scallops before Eleanor. The scallops were golden brown, resting on a bed of perfectly cooked, fragrant orzo. Eleanor stared at the plate for a long moment. She picked up her fork and prodded a scallop. She cut a small piece and placed it in her mouth, chewing slowly, her expression unreadable. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. David was peeking from behind a service pillar. Finally, Eleanor swallowed. She looked up at Sophie. The orzo is acceptable. It was the highest praise anyone had ever heard her give. But the game wasn't over. As the meal progressed, Eleanor threw a series of smaller, more subtle tests at Sophie. She'd drop her napkin and expect it to be replaced before it hit the floor. She'd ask for obscure details about the sourcing of the restaurant's ingredients. She complained that a draft from the air conditioning was disturbing her. Sophie met every challenge with the same unnerving calm. She anticipated the napkin drop. She knew the name of the farm where the asparagus was grown. She had an assistant waiter discreetly adjust a nearby vent. She was a ghost appearing exactly when needed and vanishing when not her service, a seamless, invisible ballet of perfection. As Sophie cleared the main course plates, Eleanor finally showed her hand. "You're very well trained, Sophie." Almost, suspiciously so. "Where did you work before this? Surely not some common diner." The question was a probe looking for a weakness. Sophie's past was the one thing she couldn't afford to have examined. She had to choose her words carefully. "I've worked in a few places, madam," she said, her voice even. "I've always believed that good service is about paying attention to the details." Indeed, Eleanor mused, her eyes searching Sophie's face for a crack. Details are everything. Sophie held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary before turning away. It was a tiny act of defiance, a refusal to be intimidated. As she walked away from the table, she felt a change in the atmosphere. The ripple had been sent. For the first time, someone had met Eleanor Blackwood on her own playing field, and had not just survived, but quietly, gracefully won the round. Richard Blackwood watched Sophie retreat, and for the first time all night, a faint, almost imperceptible hint of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. He raised his glass of perfectly decanted wine and took a slow, deliberate sip. Eleanor Blackwood was not accustomed to being met with competence. She was accustomed to fawning fear and failure, all of which served to reinforce her own sense of superiority. Sophie's calm proficiency was an anomaly, an irritant like a grain of sand in a perfectly lubricated machine. Since direct confrontation and impossible demands had failed to break the new waitress, Eleanor shifted her tactics to something more insidious. She began her whisper campaign. It started subtly. 2 days after their dinner, Eleanor called Mr. Davies personally. Her voice, usually dripping with condescension, was now laced with a feigned, syrupy concern. "Michael, dear," she began, "I was so troubled after our last visit. That new girl, Sophie. There's something not quite right about her. A certain hardness in her eyes. It's unsettling. I overheard her being rather short with one of the busboys. You know how I value a harmonious atmosphere. There had been no such incident. Sophie was notoriously patient and kind to the junior staff, often taking a moment to show them a more efficient way to clear a table or polish glassware. But Mr. Davies felt a cold dread creep up his spine. An accusation from Eleanor Blackwood, however baseless, was a death sentence. "I assure you, Mrs. Blackwood, Sophie has been a model employee." Davies replied, his voice more strained than he would have liked. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. Perhaps Eleanor allowed her tone, suggesting she didn't believe it for a second. But do keep an eye on her. One wouldn't want standards to slip. The next attack came during a lunch with two of her high society friends, women who hung on her every word. Sophie was not working that day, but Eleanor made sure to bring her up. The Gilded Spoon has hired the most peculiar new waitress, she announced, loud enough for the staff at the neighboring tables to hear. She seems efficient, I'll grant her that, but she has the most common accent. It quite spoils the ambience, and I'm not entirely certain I trust her around my purse. The poison spread quickly. By the next day, the rumor had morphed. The new waitress, Sophie, was rude to the staff, had a criminal record, and was probably a thief. The whispers followed Sophie down the long corridors from the kitchen to the dining room. Colleagues who had been friendly now offered clipped one-word answers. They avoided eye contact. They were afraid of being tainted by association. David was one of the few who seemed immune. He cornered Sophie by the linen closet, his face etched with worry. "It's her," he said, his voice a low hiss. "She's trying to poison the well. She's putting pressure on Davies to fire you." "I haven't done anything wrong," Sophie stated, though a familiar weariness settled in her bones. This was how it worked. It wasn't about truth, it was about power. "It doesn't matter," David insisted. "Elellanena Blackwood doesn't need a reason. She creates them. You need to be careful. Watch your back. Don't give her any ammunition." Sophie understood the warning, but her resolve hardened. She refused to cower. She continued to do her job with quiet dignity, treating her now wary colleagues with the same politeness as always. She knew that reacting with anger or fear would be playing right into Eleanor's hands. Her weapon was her unblemished record and her unwavering composure. The pressure on Mr. Davies was immense. He received another call from Eleanor, this time complaining that a friend of hers had dined at the restaurant and swore they saw Sophie pocketing a larger-than-usual tip that was meant to be shared. It was a lie fabricated from whole cloth, but it was a serious accusation. Davies called Sophie into his office. The room felt small and airless. He looked haggard, caught between his most powerful customer and an employee he knew was being targeted unfairly. "Sophie, I have to ask you about the tip from Mrs. Vanderbilt's table last night," he began, unable to meet her eyes. Sophie looked at him, her expression calm, though her heart ached with the injustice of it all. The tip was $200 on an $800 check. I recorded it in the log and pooled it as per restaurant policy. You can check the logs and ask the busboy who cleared the table with me." I know, Davies said, rubbing his temples. "I believe you, Sophie. The problem is she is relentless. She is trying to force my hand." He sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. "She hinted that if you're still working here next month, her husband might have to reconsider hosting the annual Blackwood Foundation charity gala with us. That's $500,000 in revenue, Sophie." The stakes were suddenly clear. It wasn't just Sophie's job on the line, it was the restaurant's bottom line. The weight of it settled on her shoulders. For a moment, the old impulse to flee, to pack her bag and disappear, just as she had before, surged through her. But then she thought of Eleanor's smug, cruel face. She thought of the fear in David's eyes and the weary resignation in Mr. Davies's. If she ran now, Eleanor would win. The bully would get her way, and she would move on to terrorize the next person who failed to show adequate deference. Mr. Davies, Sophie said, her voice firm. "I understand the position you're in. All I ask is that you judge me on my work, not on her lies. Give me a chance to prove her wrong. Don't let her win this way." Her quiet strength seemed to give Davies a sliver of courage. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a problem employee, but a woman of incredible integrity. He made a decision. "All right, Sophie," he said, his voice regaining some of its authority. "I'm not firing my best waitress based on slander. But be warned, she will not stop. This will get worse before it gets better." Sophie left the office with a renewed, if heavy, sense of purpose. The battle lines had been drawn. It was no longer just a job. It was a fight against the casual cruelty of a woman who thought her wealth made her invincible. Sophie didn't have wealth or influence, but she had the truth, and she had a resilience that Elellanena Blackwood could never possibly comprehend. The Whisper campaign had failed to dislodge her. Now she had to prepare for a direct assault. The opportunity for that assault came on a rain-swept Friday night. The restaurant was packed, a chaotic symphony of clattering plates, murmured conversations, and the frantic ballet of the waitstaff. The Blackwoods were at their usual table, but this time they were entertaining guests, a younger, impeccably dressed couple named Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. Robert Sterling was a rising star in the tech world, and Richard Blackwood was clearly courting him for a business deal. The pressure was immense. Eleanor was in her element, presiding over the table like a queen holding court, and Sophie once again had been personally requested as their server. She knew it was a setup. Every move she made was scrutinized by Eleanor's predatory gaze. The evening progressed with excruciating tension. Eleanor was on high alert, searching for any minuscule flaw. She complained that the music was a fraction too loud, that the bread was not warm enough, that the flowers on the table were a different shade of white than the ones she preferred. Sophie handled each complaint with stoic grace, resolving them instantly and invisibly. The main courses were the battleground. Eleanor had ordered for the entire table a complex series of dishes with specific modifications. For Mrs. Sterling, a petite, nervous-looking woman, she had ordered the Dover sole, specifying it should be filleted at the table. For her husband, the pan-seared duck breast with a cherry reduction sauce. For Richard, his usual Chateaubriand. And for herself, the lobster thermidor. The true trap, however, lay with the wine. "We will have 2 bottles tonight," Sophie Eleanor had announced. For the duck and beef, a bottle of the 2005 Penfolds Grange, and for the fish and lobster, bring us the Etienne Sauzet Pouligny Montrachet, the 2014 vintage. Sophie knew her wines. The Penfolds Grange was a classic, bold choice, but the Pouligny Montrachet was a more delicate, complex white Burgundy. It was a specific, knowledgeable selection. Sophie confirmed the order and placed it with the sommelier. The food was served, and Sophie approached the table with the cart to fillet the Dover sole for Mrs. Sterling. It was a task that required skill and precision, especially under the watchful eyes of 4 people. Her hands were steady as she expertly separated the delicate fish from the bone, her movements fluid and practiced. As she served the final portion to Mrs. Sterling, Eleanor struck. She took a sip of her Pouligny Montrachet, swirled it in her mouth, and then set the glass down with a sharp, dramatic clink. Her face contorted into a mask of disgust. "This is utterly undrinkable," she declared, her voice slicing through the restaurant's ambient noise. Nearby diners turned to look. "What is this swill you've served me?" Sophie's blood ran cold. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Blackwood. It's the 2014 Etienne Sauzet Pouligny Montrachet you ordered." "Don't be ridiculous," Eleanor snapped. "I have been drinking this wine for 20 years. This is acidic. It tastes cheap. It's probably the 2017 vintage, which was a notoriously poor year. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think you could pass off an inferior bottle on me to save the restaurant a few dollars?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. She was accusing Sophie not just of a mistake, but of deliberate deception and theft. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling looked deeply uncomfortable. Richard Blackwood stared at his plate, his jaw tight. Mr. Davies was already gliding towards the table, his face ashen. This was it. The public humiliation, the career-ending blow. But Sophie didn't panic. In the moment, Eleanor had specified the wine. A detail had lodged in her mind. She had spent hours studying the wine list, memorizing not just the names, but the stock levels, the vintages, the tasting notes. It was part of her personal code. Know your battlefield. Mrs. Blackwood. Sophie said, her voice remaining perfectly level, though her heart was pounding. I understand your concern. However, I can assure you, it is not the 2017 vintage. Oh, really? Eleanor sneered. And how would you know, dear? Do you have a suddenly refined palate? No, Madame Sophie replied calmly. I know because the Gilded Spoon does not carry the 2017 Etienne Sauzet Pouligny Montrachet. We never have. Our sommelier considered it an inferior vintage and refused to stock it. The only vintages we have in the cellar are the 2014 and the 2016. A stunned silence fell over the table. Eleanor's face, for the first time, registered a flicker of uncertainty. She had overplayed her hand, relying on an assumption that proved false. Sophie pressed her advantage, her voice still respectful, but firm. Furthermore, when you ordered your guest, Mrs. Sterling commented on your choice. My memory is quite clear. She said, "Oh, the Pouligny Montrachet. My father loves the 2014. You replied, "Yes, it's the only one worth drinking, isn't it?" I remember because I thought it was a lovely exchange. She turned her gaze briefly to the younger woman. Isn't that right, Mrs. Sterling? Mrs. Sterling, caught in the spotlight, blushed crimson. She looked from Eleanor's thunderous face to Sophie's calm one. After a moment of agonizing hesitation, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, she whispered. I did say that. It was a fatal blow. The armor had been pierced. Sophie had not only used logic and fact, but had also turned Eleanor's own guest into a witness against her. She hadn't been rude or emotional. She had simply presented the truth with unshakable confidence. Eleanor Blackwood was speechless. Her face was a storm of fury and humiliation. She had been publicly corrected, her palate questioned her lie, exposed all by a simple waitress. The other diners who had been openly staring began to whisper amongst themselves. The feared dragon had been declawed in the middle of her own lair. Mr. Davies, who had been frozen in horror, finally found his voice. Perhaps, Mrs. Blackwood, the bottle was simply not to your taste this evening. I can bring you the wine list again. Eleanor shot him a look that could curdle milk. Without another word, she abruptly stood up, threw her napkin onto her untouched lobster, and said, "Richard, we're leaving." She stormed out of the restaurant, leaving her husband and her guests in a state of mortified shock. Richard Blackwood slowly placed his own napkin on the table. He looked up at Sophie, and this time there was no mistaking the expression in his eyes. It was one of pure, unadulterated admiration. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and placed several $100 bills on the table. For the meal, he said, his voice quiet but clear. And for your trouble, your service was impeccable. He gave her a final, meaningful nod before turning to follow his wife, leaving the wreckage of the evening behind him. Sophie stood by the table, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She had done it. She had faced the dragon, and won. But as she looked at Eleanor's retreating back, she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a war. The fallout from the wine incident, as the staff began to call it, was immediate and seismic. The story ripped through the city's elite circles like a wildfire. For years, people had endured Eleanor Blackwood's tyranny in silence, but the tale of a waitress calmly and factually dismantling her in public was too delicious to keep secret. For the first time, the narrative surrounding Eleanor wasn't one of fear, but of ridicule. She became the woman who couldn't tell her vintages apart, a punchline in conversations at country clubs and cocktail parties. For Eleanor, this was a fate worse than death. Her power was derived from an aura of untouchable superiority. To be laughed at was to be rendered powerless. The humiliation festered, metastasizing into a raging, singular obsession, the utter and complete destruction of the waitress named Sophie. Her attacks lost all their previous subtlety. She became erratic, desperate. She stopped feigning concern in her calls to Mr. Davies and resorted to open threats. "If that woman is still in your establishment, by the end of the week, Michael, I will personally see to it that every one of my friends, every business associate of my husband, every person of consequence in this city, blacklists the Gilded Spoon," she shrieked down the phone line. "You will be serving tourists and nobodies within a month. Is that what you want?" Mr. Davies, however, was a changed man. Sophie's stand had been a transfusion of courage for the entire staff. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and he had seen the respectful, almost grateful look Richard Blackwood had given Sophie. He held his ground. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Sophie is an exemplary employee who was subjected to a false and public accusation. I will not be firing her." The Gilded Spoon stands by its staff. The click of Eleanor hanging up was like a gunshot. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a kind of giddy respect for Sophie. The other waiters, the busboys, even Chef Jean-Pierre treated her like a hero. They went out of their way to help her, to make sure her tables were perfectly set, to warn her if they overheard a diner sympathetic to Eleanor making a reservation. David became her self-appointed bodyguard and intelligence officer. "Mrs. Vanderbilt is at table 4, he'd whisper. "She's Eleanor's top lieutenant. Watch yourself." Sophie appreciated the support, but remained focused. She knew Eleanor's obsession was dangerous. A cornered animal is the most vicious, and Eleanor Blackwood had been backed into a corner of her own making. Sophie started noticing odd things. A car, the same dark sedan, would often be parked across the street when she finished her late-night shifts. She felt eyes on her as she walked to the bus stop. It was unnerving, a constant low-level hum of anxiety beneath her calm exterior. Eleanor's unraveling became more public. She got into a shouting match with a valet at the opera house. She was reported to have thrown a glass of champagne on a rival at a charity auction. Her carefully constructed facade of icy control was cracking, revealing the frantic, insecure woman beneath. People were no longer afraid of her. They were starting to pity her, which for Eleanor was the ultimate degradation. Her husband, Richard, seemed to grow more distant with each passing day. He attended social functions with her, a silent, grim figure by her side, but the space between them was a chasm. Sophie saw them dine at the restaurant one more time. It was a brief, tense affair. Eleanor spent the entire meal on her phone, pointedly ignoring Sophie, who was serving a different section. Richard, however, caught Sophie's eye as he was leaving. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't just a sign of respect anymore. It felt like an acknowledgement, a silent communication, that they were on the same side of a conflict he could not engage in openly. Sophie began to understand. Richard Blackwood was not a passive accessory to his wife's cruelty. He was her first and longest-suffering victim. He was trapped in a gilded cage, his life dictated by her whims and her rages. In Sophie's quiet defiance, he perhaps saw a glimmer of a freedom he had long since forgotten was possible. The true sign of Eleanor's desperation came a week before the Blackwood Foundation's annual charity gala, the very event she had used as a threat against Mr. Davies. The gala was the crown jewel of her social calendar, her chance to reign as the benevolent, powerful queen of the city's philanthropy. Against all odds, and presumably due to contractual obligations, Richard refused to break the event, was still scheduled to be held at the Gilded Spoon. Eleanor personally oversaw every detail, and her primary focus was tormenting the staff, particularly Sophie. She demanded that Sophie be assigned to the event not as a server, but as a coat check girl, a deliberate and public demotion. Mr. Davies tried to refuse, but Sophie surprised him. "It's all right, Mr. Davies," she said calmly. "I'll do it." David was aghast. "Why would you agree to that? It's a public slap in the face." Because Sophie explained, her eyes thoughtful and serious. "She's so focused on humiliating me that she's getting sloppy. She's not thinking clearly. And when people stop thinking clearly, they make mistakes." Sophie had a feeling that the gala would be Eleanor's final grand attempt at revenge. She didn't know what form it would take, but she knew it would be theatrical, public, and vicious. And as she prepared for the night, checking coats in a small, out-of-the-way room, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. She had a feeling Eleanor was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The night of the Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala arrived, and the Gilded Spoon was transformed. Crystal glasses sparkled under soft lights, a string quartet played in the foyer, and the city's most powerful and influential figures mingled dressed in tuxedos and ball gowns. From her small station in the cloakroom, Sophie watched the glittering parade. It was a world away from her own, a spectacle of wealth and power, she observed with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist. Eleanor Blackwood made her grand entrance on the arm of her husband. She wore a shimmering silver gown that caught the light a queen surveying her kingdom. Her smile was brittle, her eyes scanning the crowd with a feverish intensity. She was playing the part of the gracious hostess, but Sophie could see the strain. This night had to be a triumph. It had to erase the humiliation of the past few weeks. Sophie worked quietly and efficiently, taking coats and handing out claim tickets. Many of the guests ignored her, but a few who knew the story of the wine incident gave her small conspiratorial smiles. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a minor celebrity, a folk hero in the quiet rebellion against Eleanor Blackwood. As the evening wore on, the plan became clear. Around 10 o'clock, as the main course was being served, a sudden commotion erupted near the entrance. Eleanor Blackwood was shrieking her voice, high and piercing, cutting through the music and conversation. "It's gone, my necklace, it's gone," she cried, clutching at her throat. The necklace in question was a legendary piece, the Blackwood diamond, a flawless 50-carat stone set in platinum, rumored to be worth millions. It was her signature piece, the ultimate symbol of her status. A wave of gasps and whispers spread through the room. Richard and Mr. Davies rushed to her side. "Eleanor, calm down," Richard said, his voice low. "When did you last see it? I had it on when I arrived." She wailed her performance worthy of an Oscar. "I felt it on my neck not 20 minutes ago." Someone must have taken it. Her eyes, wild and accusatory, swept the room and then, as if drawn by a magnet, locked onto the cloakroom. On Sophie. Her Eleanor screamed, pointing a trembling finger. "The coat check girl. She was the only one near me when I came in, the only one who brushed past me. She stole it." The entire gala fell silent. Every eye in the room turned to Sophie, who stood frozen in the doorway of the cloakroom. It was the ultimate accusation, delivered on the grandest possible stage. Theft. A crime that would not only cost Sophie her job, but her reputation and her freedom. It was a perfectly diabolical plan. Security guards began moving toward Sophie. Mr. Davies looked horrified. David, who was serving nearby, watched in disbelief. "This is absurd," Sophie said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. "I did not steal anything. Search her. Search her purse. Search the cloakroom," Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with triumphant malice. "You'll find it. I know you will." This was the checkmate she had envisioned. Sophie would be publicly humiliated, arrested, and utterly destroyed. Eleanor's power would be restored, her narrative of the thieving common waitress confirmed. The head of security, a stern man named Peterson, approached Sophie. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to empty your purse and allow us to search the cloakroom." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, but she looked past the guard, past the shocked faces of the guests, and met Eleanor's venomous gaze. She took a deep breath. "That won't be necessary," Sophie said, her voice suddenly clear and resonant in the silent room. "Because I know exactly where Mrs. Blackwood's necklace is." A confused murmur went through the crowd. Eleanor's triumphant expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength. "You see, I was worried something like this might happen. Mrs. Blackwood has made her feelings about me very clear." She glanced at David, who was now standing closer, his face tense. That was her cue. When Mrs. Blackwood arrived tonight, Sophie explained she insisted on checking her own fur stole. It was a bit unusual. She came into the cloakroom herself. Right over there, she pointed to a corner of the small room, saying she wanted to make sure it was hung properly. I thought it was strange that she would be so concerned with a coat when she had a party to host. Eleanor's face had gone pale. "What are you talking about? You're just trying to distract from your own guilt." "Am I?" Sophie said, turning to the security guard. "Mr. Peterson, would you mind checking the security camera footage? There's a camera right above the cloakroom door. I asked Mr. Davies about it last week. It has a clear view of that entire corner." Mr. Davies's eyes widened in realization. He nodded curtly at Peterson. "Do it. Get the tablet from the office. Now." While one guard went to retrieve the footage, Sophie turned to her ally. "David, could you please get Mrs. Blackwood's stole?" "It's the mink. Ticket number 37. David, understanding his role perfectly, nodded and disappeared into the cloakroom. He returned a moment later, holding the luxurious fur. Mrs. Blackwood was very specific about her stole. Sophie said, her voice like a narrator revealing the final chapter. She said to be careful with the lining, that it was delicate antique silk. She looked at David. "David, would you mind checking the inside pocket?" With every eye in the room fixed on him, David reached into a small hidden pocket in the silk lining of the fur. His fingers closed around something hard and heavy. Slowly he pulled his hand out. Dangling from his fingers, blazing under the chandeliers, was the Blackwood diamond necklace. A collective, deafening gasp filled the room. Eleanor Blackwood looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and horror. She had been caught. Her final, most vicious gambit had been turned against her in the most public way imaginable. Just then, the security guard returned with the tablet, handing it to Mr. Peterson. "The footage is queued up, sir." Peterson watched the screen for a moment, his face grim. He looked up, his gaze finding Richard Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood." The footage clearly shows Mrs. Blackwood entering the cloakroom alone. It shows her slipping the necklace from her own neck and placing it inside the pocket of her stole. The final nail was in the coffin. The whispers in the room turned into a roar of disbelief and condemnation. Eleanor had not just falsely accused an innocent woman. She had orchestrated the entire charade, planting the evidence herself. Eleanor began to tremble, her eyes darting around for an escape that didn't exist. She looked at her husband, her face pleading, but Richard Blackwood's face was stone. The weary sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard finality. The silent accomplice was silent no more. He stepped forward, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. I believe he said his words, slow and deliberate. My wife is unwell. This evening is over. My sincerest apologies to you all, and especially to you, Miss Collins. He looked at Sophie, and in that look was a lifetime of apology and a profound, undeniable gratitude. He had not set the trap, but he had ensured the tools for her exoneration, the camera, the loyal staff were in place. He had given her the chance to save herself, and in doing so, she had saved him too. In the aftermath of the gala, the house of Blackwood did not just crack, it shattered. The story was too public, too scandalous to be contained. By morning, it was the headline of every society column and gossip blog in the city. Billionaire's wife fakes jewel, heist to frame Waitress. Eleanor's name, once a symbol of fearsome power, became synonymous with pathetic theatrical cruelty. Her social circle vanished overnight. Invitations ceased. Phone calls went unreturned. She became a pariah, exiled to a prison of her own, making the silence of her sprawling mansion more deafening than any condemnation. Within a month, Richard Blackwood filed for divorce. The proceedings were quiet and swift. He was by all accounts exceptionally generous in the settlement, a final cold transaction to end decades of gilded misery. He was free. At the Gilded Spoon, the change was revolutionary. The cloud of fear that had hovered over the restaurant for years simply evaporated, replaced by a bright, clear atmosphere of relief and camaraderie. The staff walked with a lighter step, their smiles genuine. They no longer felt like servants braced for a tyrant's whim, but like proud professionals in an establishment that had their back. Sophie Collins became a legend. She tried to deflect the attention, insisting she had only done what anyone would do, but her colleagues wouldn't have it. She was the woman who had faced the dragon, and without raising her voice or losing her dignity had won. She was a symbol of quiet strength and integrity. A week after the gala, Mr. Davies called her into his office. The haggard, stressed man was gone, replaced by someone who looked 10 years younger. Sophie, he began, a broad smile on his face. I don't think "thank you" quite covers it. You saved us. You saved the reputation of this restaurant, and you reminded me what it means to stand up for your people. He pushed a folder across his desk. This is a formal offer. I want you to be the new assistant manager. The pay is double what you're making now, and it comes with full benefits. But more than that, I need someone with your character, your grace under pressure, helping me run this place. Sophie was stunned. Assistant manager. It was a future she had never dared to imagine for herself, a step towards a stability she had craved for so long. The shadows of her past, the reasons she had fled her old life, seemed to recede a little further. Here she wasn't running from something. She was building something. I accept, Mr. Davies, she said, a genuine, radiant smile finally breaking through her usual composure. Thank you. A few weeks later, as Sophie was learning the ropes of her new role, a reservation was made under a familiar name, R. Blackwood. Table for one. When he arrived, Richard Blackwood looked like a different person. The weight of years seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. He was dressed in a simple but elegant suit, and he greeted the host with a warm, easy smile. He requested a table in Sophie's section, though she was no longer waiting tables. She went over to greet him personally. Mr. Blackwood, she said, offering a professional smile. Welcome back to the Gilded Spoon. It's a pleasure to have you. He stood, extending a hand. Please call me Richard, and the pleasure is all mine, Sophie. His handshake was firm, his eyes clear and direct. I never properly thanked you for your courage." "I was just doing my job," she replied softly. "You did much more than that," he said. "You reminded an entire city that integrity is worth more than wealth." That's a rare lesson. He dined alone that night, enjoying his meal with the quiet contentment of a man at peace. As he was leaving, he stopped by the host stand, where Sophie was reviewing the evening's bookings. He placed a black envelope on the counter. "This is for you," he said, "and for your staff, a small token of my appreciation." After he left, Sophie opened it. Inside was a check made out to the Gilded Spoon Employee Fund for $100,000. Tucked behind it was a small personal note. It read, "For new beginnings. Thank you." Sophie looked out across the dining room. David was sharing a laugh with a customer. Chef Jean-Pierre was holding court at the pass, his voice booming with passion, not anger. Mr. Davies was walking the floor, not with dread, but with pride. The fear was gone. The reign of Elellanena Blackwood was a ghost, a cautionary tale to be whispered about for years to come. In her place, a new era had begun, one of respect, courage, and quiet dignity, all ushered in by a waitress who refused to be afraid. Sophie Collins, the new assistant manager, stood at her post, no longer an anonymous face in the crowd, but the undisputed and beloved queen of the Gilded Spoon. And that's the story of how one woman's quiet courage toppled a tyrant. It reminds us that real power isn't about money or a famous last name. It's about integrity, truth, and the strength to stand firm when you're being pushed down. Sophie didn't have Eleanor's wealth or connections, but she had something far more powerful, a belief in herself and the truth. If this story of justice and quiet triumph resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of the underdog, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the biggest bullies can be brought down. And most importantly, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. What did you think of Eleanor's downfall? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for listening.